Hey, what's going on guys? Cookies here. We are going to go over Halls of Atonement as a healer. I'll be breaking down a lot of the important mobs throughout the dungeon, not breaking down pull by pull, but instead mostly focusing on just going over each individual mob, what you need to do to deal with them, and then the bosses, and that'll pretty much cover the video. So first up, we have a really big pull here, so I'm just going to break, like I said, I'm going to break down each mob individually and just kind of discuss them. So first up, what we will do is talk about the Obliterators, which are like the first major mob in the dungeon. So you can see everything is called Depraved something or another, the humanoid creatures in this dungeon. So we're just going to call them Obliterators. It's the Depraved Obliterators. But if they have Obliterator in their name, then you're looking at the right target. So they cast two important spells. They cast Curse of Obliteration and Wicked Bolt. So first off, Wicked Bolt is just a single target damage to whoever they're targeting, usually the tank. It'll deal a fair amount of damage, so it's something that we want to interrupt as much as possible. So if you're playing like a Shaman, like I am in this video, you want to be interrupting those Wicked Bolts as much as possible. They take like top priority over anything else. And then also using things like stuns or crowd control to help slow down how many Wicked Bolts are going out at the same time is useful. So next up, they cast Curse of Obliteration. You can see it casting right here. What it will do is put a curse debuff on one random player. You can see it right there. So it's on our Demon Hunter. Now it's important that if you can dispel this as a healer, so if you are playing a Shaman or a Druid, which can dispel curses, you actually only want to dispel this if you aren't pulling the Obliterators with another pack, which we're going to go over next, called the Collector. So anytime that you have a Collector in the pack, you can see the Collector through the mass of health bars right here in the middle, where my mouse is. So if the Collector is in the pack with the Obliterators, you do not dispel this. You rely on other classes such as Druids, Mages, and Shamans if they're playing, tank, DPS, all those other roles. They should be the ones dispelling this debuff. If they're not, you just need to be aware that it's not being dispelled, and you need to keep the player who has the debuff full HP, because what will happen is when it expires on them, it just blows up and does damage to them and anyone else around them. So don't dispel Curse of Obliteration unless there's no Collector. If there's no Collector, then you're good. And the only time that there's a Collector is, I'll go over each of the packs, but it's basically these pulls with the Shard of Halkias, which is another mob we're going to go over, and then later on in the dungeon, there's like one or two Collectors that are by themselves. Cool, so the next mob that we'll go over is the Collector. So I'm just going to let this play out for a second, and so what the Collector does is, right here, I wanted to find this. So there's two important casts the Collector does. The first one is Collect Sins, which is just a channel on the tank or whoever has aggro, and it will spawn a bunch of adds, like small little adds that'll die relatively fast and don't really do very much besides melee attack. So you can let this cast if you want, but if your tank is dying, or if you feel like the group isn't tanky enough to withstand it, then you should probably interrupt it or stun it in some way. And then as a healer, the one that we want to be watching out for is Siphon Life, which is this debuff right here, and this is exactly why we cannot dispel those curses from earlier, from the Obliterators. So I'm going to rewind it just a tiny bit when we go into this pull. You can't see it through the health bars because there's just so many health bars stacked on top of each other, but you'll see it right here. You can see it says Casting Siphon Life, and you can actually see it for a second right there before the nameplate. Oh, okay, you can actually see it the entire time. So there's the Siphon Life right here at the bottom with the Collector. As soon as this cast goes off, this is what I'm paying attention to every time I'm healing this dungeon. I'm just watching for this cast to go off, and as soon as it goes off, I'm not pressing any other abilities, and I'm going to be ready to dispel as fast as possible. So right here, our monk gets it. I'm just going to instantly dispel it off of him. Basically, it just ticks for a lot of damage every second or two on the person who has the debuffs, and it does, like, it's lethal damage with every tick, so you want to be very quick about how fast you are at dispelling it. So just being aware of it ahead of time lets you see, okay, it's casting Siphon Life, I need to stop what I'm doing, and I need to be ready to dispel. And then you can dispel it the moment it goes out, and then you're back to your thing. And then, obviously, you need to save your interrupt in case it goes off again. But for instance, like, say we were sitting here, and now our DH has another curse. If I see that the Collector dies and is no longer alive, I can dispel this curse freely, because the only thing we're saving our interrupt, or our dispel for, is for that Siphon Life debuff. Okay, so hopefully this isn't too overwhelming because this first pull makes it kind of obnoxious, but the next mob we'll talk about is the Darkblades. So the Darkblades, you can see them get pulled at the start of the dungeon when we first run by. These guys right here. And all they do is just a little frontal. So if you're playing like a Holy Paladin or a Mistweaver Monk, or you find yourself close to the tank or in melee, like right here, they do this right here. It's called Deadly Thrust, and it'll just do a quick frontal that will pretty much one-shot people in front of them, depending on key level and stuff like that. So just avoid being in melee, or if you are a melee healer, just be very aware of where the Darkblades are facing, or try to pay attention to where the tank is, and just don't stand on him, and then you should be fine. Okay, and then out of this pack that we have here, the last mob that we're going to talk about is the Shard of Halkias, which is this one I'm targeting right here. He does 2 important casts, the first being Thrash, which you just saw right there. It does a lot of AoE damage as we walk in, so we're going to walk in, and then the Shard is going to cast Thrash here in a little bit, and the Thrash just does AoE, unavoidable AoE damage to the entire group that you just need to heal through. It's as simple as that. So this is where a lot of the healing cooldowns get used, because there's 3 Shard of Halkiases throughout the entire dungeon. So you basically just want to use big healing cooldowns for each of them, because they're usually far enough apart from each other when you pull them in like Mythic Plus, even in Pugs, that all of your cooldowns will come back up for each Shard of Halkias, depending on what healer you're playing. So you can just freely kind of use like you see here, I literally popped Ascendance, I popped my Healing Tide Totem, and then I dropped a Spirit Link at the end here for the bursting stacks, which is irrelevant to the dungeon, it's just an affix. And then the other important cast it does is the Sinquake, which is right here. It just does a quick cast, and then after a brief delay, it'll spawn swirlies under every single player's feet, and you just avoid them. So be aware of the swirls and out heal the Thrashes. And you can see here another Thrash is about to happen. And I have no healing cooldown for this one, so it's a little bit more scary. But if you're preemptively preparing for it, like I have this Cloudburst totem going, then you'll be totally fine on the Thrashes. Cool, so that is those mobs. The next we're going to talk about is the Houndmaster, I believe, whenever we pull one of those. I think there's one right up here. So you can see the Houndmaster right here in the middle with these 2 dogs following them. So we'll talk about the Houndmaster and the dogs, so you can pay less attention to what else is going on, but you can also see some of the previous mobs that we talked about, like the Obliterator and the Darkblade here. So this is an instance where we have that Obliterator in the pack. It's going to cast that curse debuff on people, but there's no Collector here, so we're free to dispel that curse. So just as a reminder. Okay, so the Houndmaster does 3 things. So the Houndmaster shoots. It just spam cast shoot. It targets random people and does random damage. Right now it's on the monk, so let's just see how much damage he takes. There's a good example. It chunks for quite a bit of HP, especially when you're on fortified weeks. So just be cautious of that and keep people topped up. That's pretty much all you want to do when the Houndmaster is active, is just keep the group full health and don't delay on healing people. And then the next thing the Houndmaster does is Rapid Fire, which the Houndmaster, I don't know if you could see it there, but the Houndmaster is going to jump after this shoot. He's going to jump away right about now. He jumps to like a random location and then targets a player by like facing them, and then just spam cast Rapid Fire. And it just does this like long AoE cone of damage to everybody who's standing inside of it. So just try to be aware of where he jumps. Like right there, he jumped again, and now he's just hitting Rapid Fire. And it does a lot of damage if people aren't aware of it. So be ready to heal through it if people aren't paying attention to it. Or you can do things like stun the Houndmaster to interrupt it from casting anymore, stuff like that. But just being aware of where it jumps to helps a lot with avoiding the Rapid Fire. And then the Gargons, and then the last cast that he does is Loyal Beast, which we should see here in a second. There it is right there. And that will, if the cast goes off, it's going to enrage the dogs that were with him, or any dogs that are nearby, and they will do like a billion extra damage on all their, they just gain like a huge damage buff. So you want to avoid that at all costs. It's not interruptible. The only way to stop it from casting is by stunning or using crowd control on the Houndmaster. And then talking about the dogs, they just do a lot of tank damage, so I'm not going to go in detail about what they do. They just apply a bleed to the tank, and then that's pretty much all you need to know, is the bleed hurts a lot, and they do a lot of tank damage. Even without the bleed, just their regular auto attacks hurt the tank a lot. So whenever there's dogs in the pack, or you see the tank pulling the dogs, be ready to just keep the tank topped off as much as possible, just to be completely safe. Okay, and then the next thing in Halls of Atonement, it's not completely important as a healer, but it does help to understand how they work, is these little Stoneborns. So if you have a Venthyr in your group, you can actually take control of these. You'll see our Demon Hunter take control of it right about now. And what that does is it turns it to your side as like an ally unit, and then it will give everyone in your group a buff and then deal damage to the mobs. And it just, so if you're Venthyr, you can take those, and they're best used on like the shard pulls or more difficult pulls throughout the dungeon, like bosses and stuff. The only thing that you need to be aware of, is why I'm mentioning these guys, is when they do get pulled, they'll occasionally do this breath when they're unfriendly, this stone breath. You just need to avoid it. It's just a big frontal, and it will do a sizable amount of damage if you're standing in it. So just be aware of that when people are pulling it and controlling it, or if you're controlling it, try not to stand like right in front of it when it does it. Okay, so that goes over all of the mobs until the first boss, and pretty much all the mobs in the entire dungeon, since they kind of just repeat from here. So let's go ahead and talk about the first boss. So let me fast forward a bit until we get to the boss. Should be right around here. I'm pretty sure we do like a big pull, so again, try to ignore like the mobs and stuff, as I'm trying to just talk about the boss mainly. So the boss is going to do a few things. So as a healer, as everyone really, you need to stay inside this circle around the boss at all times. If anyone steps outside the circle, you get feared. It's dispellable, so if you see someone accidentally step outside, just be ready to dispel them. Stuff like Tremor Totem also works, so you can always drop that if you see someone running out, or if you feel like you're going to get thrown out or something. And then the boss does a few things. So I'm going to fast forward again to where we're not fighting a bunch of mobs so that it's easier to see. So right about here. So the boss is going to do Heave Debris, and it's just going to throw a swirly on you and spawn some stuff on the floor that you need to avoid. So you just dodge that and try to bait it in a way that doesn't ruin the rest of your group, like try not to bait it on top of other people and stuff if you don't have to. And then the only other thing that the boss does is, well, two things actually, is do a frontal. So you'll see it happen here on the tank in just a second. So it'll be right here, Crumbling Slam. It just does a slam and drops a puddle, just like how he throws the puddle, but instead he's just doing it to the tank. So it's just in melee, so try not to stand too close to the boss or in front of the boss mainly. And then the last thing the boss does is this Refracted Synlight. The way you tell when he's going to do it is by watching his energy bar. So if I rewind it a little bit, you can see he has 78 energy, 80 energy. When that gets to 100, he's going to stop in place and then do the Refracted Synlight, which just does these beams, and if you touch the beams, then you die. One thing when avoiding these beams is don't run up here, like how I have my mouse right here. Don't follow the beam this close. You want to be where we all are, here in the middle, because what that allows it to do is sometimes it's completely random, but sometimes the beam will turn around and go the other way, or stop like it did right there. It just stops. But sometimes it'll turn and start going clockwise instead of counterclockwise. So you just want to be ready to turn around and go the other way. Cool. So that boss is pretty straightforward. Next boss we'll go ahead and skip to is Echelon. So Echelon does a few things. I'll go to the start of the fight. First thing he's going to do is Blood Torrent. You can see it on my timers here. And that's just going to, very similar to the first boss, spawn a swirl under a random player and then drop a pool on the floor. We avoid the pools and we avoid the swirls. Next thing he's going to do is summon all these adds. You will typically get healer aggro here, especially if you're in the middle of healing when they spawn. So what I like to do is run into melee every time the adds are spawning and kind of get really close to the tank, because it allows the adds to group up. If you stay out in range, the adds will just like stand out there with you, and it's really, really, really obnoxious because they're all casters, so it makes it really hard for the tank to group them all up. And then the last thing that the boss does is this ability that you just saw right here when all these ads die. Oh, and as a healer, when these ads die, they do AoE damage. They explode. You'll see the group taking a bunch of damage here. So basically just plan a healing cooldown or just be ready to keep the group topped up whenever the imps are spawned. Because when they die, they will blow up and they can take people out pretty quickly if people aren't paying attention or if they get comboed by like the Blood Torrent and stuff like that. So the last thing that the boss does is the Curse of Stone and the Stone Shattering Leap. So I'll just show it here. So the Curse of Stone applies a curse debuff to every single person in the party. If you can dispel curses, you want to dispel the person who has this right here, the Stone Shattering Leap. You can see the boss targeting the mage, and you can see it right here with Bigwigs. And there the mage dispel themselves, but if you're by yourself in a pug and stuff, you definitely always want to dispel whoever has it if you can dispel curses. The reason for this is because they will get stunned from the Curse of Stone, and then if the boss jumps on top of them with this Stone Shattering Leap, it will do a bunch of damage and apply a bleed to them. I don't know if it ever happens in this pull specifically. I don't think it does. I'll just fast forward through real quick just to see if it ends up happening. No, it does not. So basically if... Oh, there it goes. Okay, so if it hit our mage there, you can see how much damage he just took in his health. He was literally full HP and went down to about 10% on a plus 24 fortified key, so that's not even tyrannical. So there it goes. And then it puts this debuff on him for the next 8 seconds, which just is a bleed, basically. It will just do constant ticking damage to him, like heavy ticking damage, over the next 8 seconds. So you can see right there, he just died and went into his pod. So it's very important to, because it's very common in pugs to get hit by that, you just want to heal people up who have that debuff or who get hit by the leap. And that is pretty much the entire fight as a healer. So next up, we have mobs that we've already seen in the dungeon, so I don't need to explain them. This is the only other place, like I mentioned before, where the collector is. So there's one collector for each shard, and then there's one more collector here on this pack. You can see it better when you're actually in there, but it's like in the room right before the boss. This boss is very straightforward, so I'm going to talk about it very quickly. She does 2 important things: Volley of Power, which should cast here in a second. So the Bolt of Powers you can pretty much ignore. The Volley of Power is what we want to be interrupting. There, it's right there. If it goes off, it just does unavoidable AoE damage to the entire group. So just be sure to keep the group topped off in case that goes off. And then the last thing she does is spawn these little ads. You'll see them spawn in a second here, or you would have just seen one right there. But I'll mention when it spawns. And what it does is fixates a random player. There it is right there. It's this ghast in the middle of the room, or this ghost, whatever you want to call it. Oh yeah, it is a ghastly parishioner. It'll fixate a player, and then it does pulsing AoE damage to everybody depending on proximity. So the closer you are to it, the more damage you'll take. And I think if you there is like an outrange for it, and it just needs to be ran into these lanterns on the side of the room. It doesn't do very much damage, but just being aware that it does do AoE damage will help you understand to, like, you know, keep people at full HP, or to know where the damage is coming from when they spawn. Like right here, you'll see me start taking a little bit of damage as it spawns. So next up we have the room after the boss with what's his name here, Inquistor Sigar. He's gonna just spawn all these little manifestations of envies, spam Wicked Bolt. So the Wicked Bolt just does tank damage. It doesn't do nearly as much as the Wicked Bolts that we saw earlier. And when he does Dark Communion, that's when he's going to spawn all these little manifestation of envy ads, and they fixate random players. You can see the fixates right here, so just keeping the group nice and healthy, and using healing cooldowns here is totally fine if you have them up. Just keeping the group nice and topped off until all the manifestations are dead, and then the boss itself literally does nothing. He just stands here, you avoid pools on the floor, and he doesn't really do any damage outside of the summoning the manifestations. And once all the ads are dead in the entire room, he won't summon any more manifestations with the Dark Communions. So last boss. So the only thing you need to know about the last boss is the Stigma of Pride, I believe, as a healer. which is going to be a debuff that he puts on the tank. I'm not tracking it on my frames, unfortunately, but you can see him cast it, and you can see it on like DBM. It's basically a debuff where it lasts, I think, about 16 seconds, maybe longer, and it does increasing damage as the debuff persists on the tank. So like the longer the tank has the debuff, the more damage it's going to do. So when it's first applied, don't have to worry about it too much, but then like very quickly it'll start to ramp up very fast in how much damage it's doing every second to the tank. So being aware of that and being able to keep the tank nice and healthy is very important. And then the last thing for this boss is at 70% health and 40% health, he's going to throw all the statues out like this in some kind of cross formation, and then use Ritual of Woe, and whoever soaks the beams, you just soak the beams that are going, because he'll target all the statues with the beams, and you just need to stand in the way of them. There is a way to soak multiple. Like here we have our tank soaking 2 of them, I believe. And you can see I'm tracking the debuff on LVI here, and these people are the ones soaking the beams, and they just need to be healed up. It just does constant damage to the players. And if the beam doesn't get soaked, it'll hit the statue and then do AoE damage to everybody that does a lot more fatal damage. So keep everybody nice and healthy as usual, and you should have a good time on this boss. So that is pretty much it for Halls of Atonement, I believe. Hopefully I didn't miss anything. If I did, mention it in the comments down below. That'll just be a collection of other random tips and things that people want to put down there, or things that I missed. But hopefully this video was helpful for you, and I hope you are enjoying 9.2. And yeah, have a good one. Thanks for watching.